Alright, folks, I'm back. Looking a little better, not great. But life goes on. Alright, today we're going to do what we should have done a little while ago, and that is do a review of the important points of Chapter 2. Now, one thing you all need to learn how to do, and as part of the educational process, is to learn how to read a chapter, or for that matter, an entire book, and concentrate on what is important. Make sure you understand the important points. And if there is material that is ancillary, secondary, less than important, to just pass it by. You don't need to understand everything. And in the case of Chapter 2, I'm going to vary a bit from the outline that I sent you. That is the material on pages 31 and 32. We'll get to the other points in a minute, but let me focus on 31, 32, because even though I like this book very much, I think it's a very good and straightforward book, they tend to get involved in material that is sometimes less relevant to the topic at hand. For example, indifference curves. Indifference curves are a central concept in economics, but to our purposes here and to the discussion of comparative advantage, which is the heart of Chapter 2, I don't think they're really all that central. But I'll get back to them in a moment. But on page 31 and 32, particularly 31, the top of 31, that is really the essence of what comparative advantage is all about. And again, comparative advantage is the economic theory developed by David Ricardo and elaborated on by future economists as to why nations should trade. Why it is the economic benefit of everyone. We saw that in the problem, both on the problem set and on the quiz, which I'm glad to say most of you got correct or close to correct, that everyone benefits when we trade. And in fact, that has been the historical case since the beginning of the Bretton Woods system in 1972 and 1944, and its transformation in 1972. Now again, we have to pay attention to the terminology here. It is comparative advantage. It is not absolute advantage. And if we look at the top of page 31, where in this hypothetical case, and economics as a social science, a rather rigorous social science, certainly more rigorous than political science, which is sort of a hodgepodge of ideas, more hodge than podge in some cases. We simplify reality with what is called models. We know we cannot understand all of reality all at once. It's too complex. Whether it be the phenomenon studied in physics, the weather outside, or economics. Reality is very complex. The weather, for example, is a function of what many believe to be millions of variables. And so to really understand something, to focus in and understand a key point, which in this case, in economics, is comparative advantage. We have to simplify things, knowing that this is not reality. Why nations trade has all kinds of reasons, and we'll go into others later. But they would not trade if there was no economic benefit to do so. There would be other reasons, political or whatever, but if there is not economic benefit, nations are not going to trade. Comparative advantage tells us that there is. Now you notice in the data that, again, this hypothetical case comparing the United States to Brazil and the production of only 2 products. Computers, high technology, and shoes, less high technology. The one, computers, is what we call high value added. After all, what's in a computer? A bunch of silicon, wires, and a few other things. Virtually no raw materials. And yet, they are these marvelous machines that now operate at incredible speeds. And that is what we call a high value added product. You're taking a bunch of wires and a few other things, plastic, and producing this incredible machine. And that requires highly trained labor, highly developed capital, that is machinery. Shoes are value added. Anything is value added, even a piece of chalk is value added. But it's relatively low value added. You're taking some leather, fashioning it, and producing something that we can wear on our feet. And less developed countries, and Brazil was for a while, it's beginning to catch up, sort of a middle-range country now. They concentrate initially on low value-added products because you don't have to have highly skilled labor. The technology required is not that sophisticated. And it provides them an entry into the world market. Computers is a different story. Even though in our hypothetical problem here, Brazil is producing some computers, and we're assuming equal quality here, which is probably not true, but we'll just assume it for the moment. Assumptions are the keys to models. Brazil, and this is the case in reality, produces computers but at a very high cost. A very high cost. The United States produces computers, but despite higher labor costs, at a relatively low cost. And that's one thing to keep in mind here, folks. Highly developed nations like the United States may have high individual labor costs, but in terms of producing a product like a computer, their labor costs are actually relatively lower. And so we see in the example given that the United States has an advantage of 10 to 1, 50 over 5, to the output per worker per year of computers. In other words, an American worker, on average, can produce 50 computers a year, while a Brazilian worker can only produce 5. And that means the United States has an enormous comparative advantage in the production of computers. Naturally, they're also probably of higher quality, but we're not considering that now. We're just looking at numbers. In terms of shoes, pairs of shoes, can't wear just one shoe. Although I did when I was a kid. Drove my mother nuts. Anyway, the United States still has an advantage. The average American worker produces 200 pairs of shoes a year. The average Brazilian worker produces 175 pairs of shoes a year. So on both counts, the United States has an absolute advantage. But again, this is not the theory of absolute advantage. This is a theory of comparative advantage. And what David Ricardo's theory says, the classical theory of trade, is that both of these nations will benefit. That is, their standard of living, their income will rise, their consumption of both computers and shoes will rise if the United States concentrates on that product, computers, in which it has an enormous comparative advantage. Again, 10 to 1, 50 to 5. And even though the United States still has an advantage in shoes, it should let Brazil produce the shoes. Because here, the advantage that the United States has is there, but it's much smaller. It's not 10 to 1. It's about 1.14 to 1. And so the United States, with scarce labor, scarce capital, remember in economics, scarcity is the basic principle. There's not unlimited labor. There's not unlimited capital. There's not unlimited anything. Even air these days. Ask the Chinese. So, in terms of allocating our scarce resources and Brazil's scarce resources, they should concentrate on producing shoes, and we should concentrate on producing computers. Brazil will tap into our comparative advantage, huge comparative advantage, in the production of computers. And so the computers that they get, that they buy from us, will actually be cheaper, let alone better, than the computers that they produce. And the United States will get shoes from Brazil, through trade, that will actually be cheaper than the shoes that we produce here. Because it is expensive, relatively speaking, for the United States to commit labor to the production of shoes, when we can take that labor, retrain it, whatever, and have them produce computers. And that is the reason why the two countries should trade. And the indifference curve, which is just a mixture of products that you consume, how many computers, how many shoes, and up and down that curve. Both of our indifference curves, compared to what we have under autarky, where there's no trade, will shift outwards. We will both benefit. So when I give you a similar problem on the next quiz, after you come back from your spring break, it is spring, I will give you something along the lines of this chart on page 31. Asking you under what conditions can nations trade and under what conditions will they not. So you need to understand this. So if you have any questions on this part of the chapter, please let me know. This is absolutely crucial, okay? You must understand this chart on page 31. It's really quite simple. It's just a matter of ratios. All you have to do is look at it and realize that the United States, because of more technology, more capital, has an enormous advantage. The average American worker is producing a lot more computers per year than is the average Brazilian worker. And that is the reason why they trade. And when you switch labor or capital from one product to another, you're dealing with so-called opportunity costs. The United States gives up the production of a certain number of shoes. Brazil gives up a certain number of computers. And that is called the opportunity cost. And you see that computed on the right side of the chart. Just sit down and figure out the arithmetic there. So for example, under opportunity cost, one pair of shoes, Brazil, 0.03. Well, how do you get that figure? Well, you get that figure by dividing 5 by 175. Brazil's 5 computers that they produce versus the 175 shoes that they produce. 0.03 pairs of shoes. United States, if it produces shoes, gives up 0.25 computers. That's very expensive. The United States, to devote labor to the production of shoes, we're giving up 0.25 computers. That is 1/4 of a computer. Well, that's very expensive because a computer is a more high value added product than is a pair of shoes. Keep in mind, the United States historically, and even today, is a labor short country. Even though we have some employment, too much in fact, the fact of the matter is that compared to countries like Brazil, certainly China, India, we have in our workforce many fewer workers. And that means that we have to allocate them as rationally as possible. We don't have a lot of workers to waste. Brazil can apply its workforce to the production of shoes because, relatively speaking, it has more labor. And it does not produce a computer as efficiently. Alright, I'll end here for this part of the discussion. Come back to you in a few minutes and go over other parts of the chapter. But again, one thing for you all to learn is how to read a chapter and focus on what is important. Not get bogged down in the details. And even though understanding indifference curves is important in economics, opportunity cost, and other matters discussed in this chapter, I'll go over those in a minute, some of those awkwardly named theorems in a moment. It really is the material on page 31 that is essential and which you must understand. I'm not going to give you graphs like they do in other parts of this chapter with curving lines, etc., etc. But I will give you something comparable to the chart on 31. All right. I don't look too bad, do I?